Cheers, everyone. It's Sleepy Reader, aka Damien. Another installment of my comic book reading diary that I like to call Comic Book Thoughts. You could call it a comic book review if you want. I don't like to think of it as exactly that, but it's close enough. I read an odd assortment of things this past week. And on a previous video, I mentioned how I wasn't reading as much as I thought I would, or as consistently as I thought I would, after I stopped having a pull list at the comic shop. Even though I've got endless reading material stored up, which is why I stopped my pull list at the comic shop. And Tacky 616 pointed out the obvious, which for some reason hadn't occurred to me, which is that without that regular weekly rhythm, one just doesn't read in a regular daily and weekly kind of way. So you read more in spurts. I think part of the problem for me is when you know there isn't a regular rhythm, you're more likely to put things off. You're like, oh, well, I can always catch up. I can always read more later. So I still would like to get into some kind of regular reading rhythm. And maybe I'm getting back towards that. Anyway, I picked up recently Night Fever, the newest book by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, which was kind of a standalone, which I really appreciate. You know, they've been doing this series of sort of interconnected but standalone graphic novels about Reckless, and this is just basically a short story, or what might be like a novella or something standing by itself. And to me, my plan is I will turn the camera around and show the interior artwork and go more in depth in things and perhaps spoil things a little bit. So I do a quickie coverage first, and then I go inside. But my basic feeling of this was the kind of wild, nightmarish story, kind of on a male excess fantasy about male freedom kind of story that I really would have liked to have written in my 20s. And I thought Brubaker pulled it off very nicely. Sean Phillips' art was very good. And I felt like the star of the show was Jacob Phillips's coloring, that he really made this story. He put the frosting on the cake, I suppose, but more than just that, he made the whole cake stick together in an awesome way. It takes place. I know there's a whole sort of genre of this, someone who sort of accidentally slips past outside of the normal life and into this sort of underworld nightlife. It's literally called Night Fever. There's some movies like that. And their names are slipping me by, but I really, in my early or mid 20s, throughout my 20s, I wanted to write a story kind of like this. Now that I'm older, it does feel a little more based on a young man's kind of perception of things, if that makes sense. Although Ed Brubaker is probably only a little bit younger than me. Anyway, very cool. Where did I pick this up? I think I picked this up in Olympia when I was visiting Lorenzo. I was just surprised to find a Dan Dare book written by Garth Ennis. It was issue 1 from the now defunct Virgin Comics. I don't know how far they got with it. And I enjoyed this. It was a bit of a British military fantasy, sort of the Brits who were the ones who won World War I, and the ones who were, who came in and did the job that had to be done, had the right stuff or whatever, that kind of myth about the British military, placed in an interesting science fiction setting. Unfortunately, the art on the inside was not as compelling as the art on the cover, but it was pretty good art. So I definitely hope to dig up more of these. I think I bought this for like 25 cents or something. So I don't know if I can get all the other issues that cheaply. And then I've been picking up lots and lots of Savage Sword of Conan. I completed my Savage Sword of Conan run, which sort of leads me to, even though I have all of the Conan the Barbarian stuff now in omnibuses to pick up certain issues when I find them in nice condition from the original run, from the original comics. And this one was a surprisingly good issue of Conan the Barbarian. It turned out to be the second half of a story, but I'm kind of having fun just plunging in, and I may go find the first half of the story because I think I own it. It's just in my boxes somewhere in the storage unit that I rent. So, but I'll show you more of the artwork there. I think it's definitely, it's a good story by Roy Thomas, and in fact, he adopted it from someone else's short story, someone else's fantasy short story, and he turned it into a Conan and Red Sonja story. And so there's fun bits done by Roy Thomas, but I think what really kicks it up is this is a particularly good issue art-wise from John Buscema. And in fact, I've been nibbling around in Roy Thomas's A Barbarian Life, where he covers all the first 80 issues of Conan, talking about how he wrote them, and he specifies this issue and the one before it as some really peak John Buscema art. So I look forward to showing you the inside of that. Then for something completely different, I finally read Power Wash, which I bought quite a long time ago when a bunch of people online were talking about it. I really enjoy the art. The basic premise of the story is very funny, in that this guy gets kind of pulled into this job power washing people at orgies. However, it didn't go very far with its premise or its character. I think maybe it's more interesting to people who have perhaps been following this character Tedward throughout other issues of Josh Pettinger's regular comic Goiter. I do plan to now seek out Goiter because I really enjoy the art, and it's fun seeing this kind of oddball comic. But I actually had overly high expectations for Power Wash. I didn't have a whole lot of expectations for Black Phoenix, which I picked up at Floating World Comics. I don't know how far it gets distributed, because it is distributed by... It's published by Recoil, which I assume is the creator's own press, Rich Tommaso, and then it's distributed by Floating World Comics, which is a comic book store here in Portland. And it's like a anthology, a one-man anthology, a one-man collection of short pieces, many of which connect together, but not all. I should show the art later. It's really fun to read. It's never... He's not like a brilliant short story writer, so it's fun, but there's always couldn't there have been a little more of a twist or something? But he is sort of trying, I think, to meld old EC crime comics with other kind of old things, and it also has a Tintin vibe here and there, and even an Archie vibe or something, and a little bit of the vibe of modern crime comics, like Stray Bullets. But I think this is the first issue that collects a bunch of comics that he published for Patreon, for his Patreon supporters. And I'm trying to figure out if it's still ongoing, if he's still doing it on Patreon, or if it's all over. But I think there'll at least be a few more volumes. This is the winter-spring volume. So I should ask them next time I'm at Floating World if there's going to be more issues of this. And also along the art comic side of things, I read Violenzia and Other Deadly Amusements by Richard Sala. And I enjoyed this, but again, kind of like the Tedward thing, the Power Wash, I had overly high expectations. Not because I'd heard anyone talk about this particular volume, but I've heard people rave about Richard Sala. And there were some really good things in here and some really sort of, okay kind of stuff in here. Particularly, to me, the stories about Violenzia herself, which I was looking forward to, sort of pulpy craziness, did not push the envelope far enough, I felt, and were just mostly kind of childlike pulpy stories, and not a spoof of them. if you see what I'm saying. There's some other stuff in here that reminds me a lot of, and now that I have the camera on, I've forgotten his name again. I was talking to someone about it yesterday and kept forgetting the name. A guy who doesn't do comics, but he's very comics related, and I will type the name down below and maybe talk about it some more. Again, in the super art, even further in the artsy thing, this Rise of the Oceans, I found out about this. I think it's a, what's it called? Risograph printed comic that you buy pretty much. There was only 100 copies printed. I have copy number 43. I heard about it from Ryan Carey on his Patreon blog, which I'll put a link down below because I still think if you're interested in alternate comics and other kind of well-written essays, Ryan's stuff is well worth checking out. And he's just using Patreon as his blog site now. So there's free stuff that anyone can read. And then if you really like it, you can support Ryan, which will probably lead you to buying things like Rise of the Oceans. Interesting art, not much of a story. Definitely, a wordless comic. And I really appreciated the art style and the design quality and the colors, which I think is a risograph kind of thing, to have a sort of an interesting color palette. But I really thought if you threw some words in there to to give your story more layers, this would have been much better. I think it's, as much as it seems cool to do wordless comics, words are a really good element of comics. Although, then I read this book 2 of Storm. I don't know if in Europe this really would have been book 2 of Storm, but it's certainly a perfectly fine place for me to start in. But it was way too wordy, and the wording was very awkward, and it could just be the translation. And even the lettering I was not a big fan of. And this is very much a story that feels like a cross between Edgar Rice Burroughs and Flash Gordon. And not, if you take it just for the story, not a particularly well-crafted pastiche of those kinds of things. But the art definitely makes it fun, and there's something a little addictive about this art style with this sci-fi fantasy kind of combination that makes me crave more, even though it wasn't done that well, which is funny. If I were a kid, I would have thought it was brilliant, I think. I would have been able to fill in all the gaps, the lack of characterization, the lack of emotional impact. I would have, as a child reader, I would have filled that in. As an adult, I expect the writer to do more for me, in a sense. But I kept thinking as I was reading this, I could imagine this script might have been written by, say, Lynn Carter, who specialized in pastiches of Robert E. Howard and Edgar Rice Burroughs in particular, and Jack Vance and stuff like that. And Lynn Carter might have done a slightly better version of it, or not, because it depended on the Lynn Carter book. Anyway, I will flip the camera around and show more and talk more. I'll try to make little chapters so that if you see that I'm covering such and such a book that you don't want spoiled at all, you can skip over it. So, see you on the flip side. So let's start with Night Fever. I think even from the cover, it's interesting the minimal image that they use. It almost expresses, I feel like, the confidence the Brubaker Phillips team has that the audience knows who they are. They're kind of a brand name for the slightly more in the know comic book reader audience, or the in the know comic book reader audience. And it almost only takes shape as a real image on the cover once you notice that hand there, that this is a whole figure and that it's not just what the white decoration is. But anyway, I think it's a sign of a further evolution of the career of Brubaker and Phillips, and we'll see. Hopefully, this will sell quite well. That they don't have to do a big come hither to the audience of here's why you need to read this book. You just see their name on it, and you see that it's a nice hardcover, and for people like me, it's an automatic pickup, and for I think a lot of other people too. A nicely produced volume, and the basic story is of your middle-aged person with a job and a family and lots of responsibilities. But he happens to have a kind of glamorous job where he travels overseas representing the books of a publisher to sell overseas rights for that publisher. And that kind of job might be more done by agents now, but I think it used to be a normal part of your book contract that and I think this is maybe set in the 70s. Or is it the 80s? I'm not sure. But anyway, it used to be, and probably book publishers still do this sometimes, where they have a contract where they split international rights with the author, and then they become kind of the author's agent in other countries. So that's what this guy is, and he's reading one of the books he's going to need to try to sell at a book convention in Paris. And he finds in the book that there's a dream in it that is a dream he remembers having, like a recurring dream he once had, that seemed to be about, being kind of savage and freedom from your regular everyday life. And he's kind of really angry, and he's having trouble sleeping and everything. Anyway, all of this kind of leads him to the darker side of life in Paris. And particularly, almost kind of a cliche, the rich people's party orgy with a masquerade. So there is a lot of sort of... Oh, the dog's barking. I am babysitting Travis's dog, Sam, this weekend, and he is with me out in the backyard. Anyway, you can see the beautiful coloring. And I just became, I've become more and more aware of coloring ever since I started YouTube. But I just really felt like the coloring here was just so right. And when Jacob Phillips first started coloring, and he was taking over for Betty Breitweiser, who did such a fantastic job, I think I underrated him a little bit, although I liked his coloring. But now he's one of my favorite colorists, at least when he's coloring his dad. I'm not sure if he colors anyone besides his dad and himself. There was that comic he did himself. So our hero gets kind of sucked in by this charismatic figure of the night. What's he called? Darn it. Come on. Rainier. And he's going under a fake name, Griffin. And so some of this stuff is kind of cliche and everything, but the overall vibe of it, like I said, with the masquerade and it has a little bit of the vibe of like Fight Club, that kind of story. So it's just this very sort of masculine fantasy of breaking away from the inhibitions of life and just becoming more of like a wild animal and getting away with it. But ultimately that doesn't work out quite the way he wants. In a way, a bit of a spoiler here. I won't show you it, and I won't tell you too much, but I was a bit disappointed that there was a happy ending to it all. And a return to normality. Although another part of me was like kind of relieved. And there was also a science fiction twist here that I really thought was cool, and I would have liked a teeny bit more of it. However, it might have all been a hallucination. I think we're supposed to think it probably was, but with a slight doubt that maybe there are aliens at these super rich people's parties, and they've been manipulating human history and are planning our downfall. I don't know. That was kind of cool. The goofy science fiction writer in me wanted to follow up with that more, but it probably would have taken away from the story to do that too much. So yeah, fantastic read. I'd say, part of the way through it, I did get caught up a little bit on, oh, this is like all these cliched kind of things you've already seen before. I guess like the movie After Hours and things like that. And also Eyes Wide Shut, that kind of thing. But still, it stands up on its own ultimately, and it is a really fun comic to read. And for this kind of genre of, someone who slips into the wild night side of life, it's a very cool addition to that genre, you might say. Here's the Dan Dare comic. Beautiful cover. How long did Virgin Comics last? I don't know. There's ads for a whole lot of comics they were doing in the back here. Let's see. Something called The Stranded, written by Mike Carey, a favorite writer of mine. Art by Virgin Studios. That's kind of interesting. They talk about Virgin Studios doing science fiction. Here's some stuff that I think is based on South or Indian and Pakistani or something like that kind of things. I don't know. I think there were some other ads scattered throughout here too. Yeah, so I think Virgin made a big stab at comics, spearheaded by Ron Marz, hiring some big name writers like Garth Ennis, but I don't think it lasted long, and I don't know if it was a failure or Virgin lost interest or what happened. So inside, the artwork's a little more workmanlike. The colors are a little not quite working for me, but they're okay. And I like what Ennis is setting up here, although it's all very on the nose. There's the sort of noble British military man, and then there's all the bureaucrats and the modern people who don't understand how superior the old way of British life was. And then there's the alien invasion. But it's done very nicely, very satisfying. I'm pretty eager to get to another issue. I may, if it continues in this rah-rah old school Britain fashion, I may kind of snicker at it while I'm enjoying it. So with this Conan and Red Sonja story, I guess I didn't realize, so Red Sonja appears in her bikini outfit for the first time in Savage Sword of Conan issue number 1. And then they continue to have Red Sonja and Conan have adventures together following directly after that in 2 issues of Conan the Barbarian. And this issue, like I said, Roy Thomas pointed out that this was some particularly good work by John Buscema. But on top of that, it's inked by Krusty Bunkers, which was Neil Adams' studio. Whoever happened to be in the studio helped ink that issue when they had a rush job. And Neil Adams would do a lot of the faces and the main figure. So I'm imagining like this whole part, at least, was done by Neil Adams, if not the whole splash page. But I think we're getting a lot of Neil Adams inking John Buscema, along with a bunch of other inkers who remain anonymous. Could be anybody. Could be Claus Janson and friends. I don't know. But it looks a lot like Claus Janson inks to me, too. But so we come in the middle of the story. Conan and Red Sonja are being held captives by these 2 sort of wizard vampires who like to take lovers but eventually kill them. And they have been breeding these creatures to feed on. But they need to replenish the gene pool of these creatures because their blood isn't so good anymore. So they blow this magic stuff on Conan that makes him unable to control himself, and he has an orgy. Basically, Conan is raped. They don't say it. And Roy Thomas, in his book about writing these things, doesn't say that Conan is raped. But I feel this is Conan being raped in a drug-induced orgy that he doesn't want to take part in. But then later, he doesn't seem to reflect on that too much after a panel or 2. And he decides to seduce the female vampire wizard. And she's very interested. And I figured he was just playing a game with her, but at some point in the comic, he tells Red Sonja, I would have been happy to, boink her. So kind of weird stuff going on. But anyway, it was just a fun read. Not, based on Robert E. Howard stuff at all, really, when you have Red Sonja and you have these vampire wizards from another person's sword and sorcery story that was adopted. It's adapted by, I want to look into it, but Roy Thomas doesn't know what happened to this writer. Adapted from a story by David A. English, which was something Roy Thomas read in a semi-professional sword and sorcery magazine. There's a lot of that in fantasy and science fiction, these semi-professional magazines that pay the writers a little bit, but not a lot, and don't usually get a lot of distribution. These are actually the two weakest pages, I thought, where Conan hallucinates different moments from his past, like this octopus creature he fought in one issue, and this Gorgon-like creature he fought in another issue. These are recapitulating Barry Windsor Smith issues, so I wonder if Sal Buscema was less excited by that part of it. Also, when I read Roy Thomas's recollections of writing these issues, it's unclear if he does any of the plotting ahead of time, or if he just gives Barry Smith the story that they're taking the plot from. I mean, they're not stealing it because they paid the writer for the plot from his short story. If he just sends the short story to Barry Smith and says, hey, change this to be about Conan and Red Sonja instead of the barbarian that is in the story, and then he puts in dialogue afterwards, or if he rewrites the plot to fit, in other words, how much of this is made up by, how much of the adapting is done by John Buscema and how much by Roy Thomas, I'm unclear. I guess it doesn't matter ultimately that it's a good job, but it kind of become more aware of Roy Thomas and the vagueness of who gets credit for what, kind of, from reading his book and reading some other stuff by Roy Thomas, some other commentaries. Anyway, really cool one. If you like Conan, I'm sure you can dig up this issue and probably the issue before it, 43, for not too much money. The cover is unusual to be by John Buscema instead of Gil Kane, but also to be inked by John Buscema, although it looks kind of a hastier than usual cover for Buscema when he draws covers. But I like it still. Anyway, I had a lot of fun reading that. Yellow background. I know there's some people out there who think yellow is a horrible background color. Or was there some rule against it at some point? You don't have to worry too much about color with Power Wash. It's done in this black and white style. And I really do. I think I really like his, for sort of indie art. I think he really, Josh Pettinger really knows what to do with a black and white page and how to make the black and white really pop and work. His faces are a little odd, like people always have this kind of stiff, uncomfortable look on their face, which at times I like and at times I can imagine getting kind of sick of. And while a lot of this takes place at orgies where they're spraying people off, it's not done in a very sensationalistic way. I mean, the whole thing is a sensationalistic concept, right? But the way it's drawn, it's not gonna turn too many people on or get people too crazy. So definitely a comic for adults, but not horrible. Not horribly tasteless or something, and more just all done for a joke. Yeah. So I don't know. I want to explore the world of Josh Pettinger a little more, even though I had kind of overly high expectations. And this sort of hapless character could grow annoying after a while, but I would like to see a little more. And I think if I understand correctly, in his book Goiter, he does a variety of different characters, not just Tedward. Okay, I'm not even sure how to. There was like well over like 120, 150 pages in this first issue of Black Phoenix, so it's hard a little bit to talk about. But it's sort of set off by all these joke ads that are ads evoking things from the past. We free as a bird, quick action opportunity, cash prizes. But they look like old comic book ads, but they're all about things for crime, like this special getaway car that is a jet powered car, so it's really fast, and it has blood-proof seats and things like that. So, and some of the art in the ads, or I guess that's just an interstitial piece. I assume that Richard Tommaso drew these also. So it shows he doesn't only draw in this extremely simple cartoony style, but he chooses to most of the time. He has a preference for it. So what you get in here is crime stories, detective stories, a little bit of horror stories, a kind of a western here and there, and some of these characters reoccur, but there's a little disjointedness. Like this character seems to be killing people in her sleep, but it's only in a later story that it's revealed that she is actually a hit woman for the mob, but she only does her hits when she's in her sleep. And it's almost like maybe Tommaso changed his mind about where the story was going when he came back to it later. But once I kind of got into the rhythm of it. I didn't expect any one story to deliver a huge punch, but a lot of little tickles, and I kind of enjoyed that, and I thought, well, I'll put it down, but let me read one more story. And then, well, I'll put it down, but let me read it one more story. I mean, this is a good example. I worked with a zombie about a private detective who has X-ray specs, so he's called the X-ray Spectre. It's unclear why he always wears a mask, but he always does, and he has his special X-ray specs, and it allows him to solve crime. But there isn't really a whole lot of crime solving in this story. They track down the source of the zombies and they stop it, but it's not done through very much detecting or competence on the part of the character, and maybe that's part of the joke. But so it kind of ends, and it was a fun little ride, but like did not blow my mind. This one western in here was even weirder, where it makes a sudden jump, and the twist at the end is just kind of strange. This Face of Evil, this is the kind of thing that kind of seems like a spoof of a EC comic kind of horror crime story with the twist. I won't spoil. Here's an odd one where this a reoccurring character, a retired hitman for the mob, but maybe in some of the stories he's actually still in the mob and still active, so that's a bit confusing. But here in Pregnant Pause, he's just accompanying his goddaughter to get an abortion because her boyfriend dumped her, and he wants to get revenge on the boyfriend, but he doesn't because he can't quite find out the guy's address. And here we got to return to the person who, in this killer in my sleep, in this version of the story, when we return to her, she turns out to be a criminal on purpose, criminal type of person. And anyway, and it's revealed she's like heavily involved in the mob and stuff. I like these ones that have almost, a little Lulu vibe. This also has a vibe from, I don't know, some kind of European cartoony comic. This one's even got French. Coco est belle, faites attention. I don't know all the sources that he is playing on. Here, this looks like one of those New Yorker cartoons, but it's an ad for Band-Aids. This here, that, I don't know. This evokes a little more Tintin kind of stuff, but then back to kind of his usual style. I'm not sure if that's based on anyone. But this looks like it's a crime story, but it turns into a horror story, but it doesn't go in the direction a normal horror story would. It's fun to see how he plays with color, keeping very simple colors, but making different stories stand out from each other. Like this one, that's beautiful use of all these different shades of green. I really like that. And the paper is very much, feels like newsprint, like a higher quality newsprint. Secrets entrusted to few, the unpublished facts of life. Okay, a few more to go. So better keep going. I get lost in whatever book I'm pointing the camera at. Violenzia. Yeah, so as I mentioned, it was a little bit on the disappointing side. There wasn't as much to the story, or it could have just been a story for children, except for, a few slightly disturbing touches. But I did like, here's this piece called The Forgotten, and it's just a really cool series of illustrations that go along with this prose piece, which is kind of just a pondering kind of thing. It's not much by itself, but the all the different images as the character walks through town and doesn't seem to notice he's so busy, he's so lost in thought, he doesn't notice the world around him, which sort of evokes a world of old horror movies and other things. And the famous artist writer whose name still eludes me. I'm not sure why I can't. I've just sort of got a little tick in my brain that is keeping me from remembering his name. And even more so, the next piece in here, which is basically an alphabet. The author that I think he's imitating does alphabet books all the time, that are pretend children's books that are really for adults or for an adult sense of humor. Edward Gorey, that's the name. I feel like this is very Edward Gorey influenced. Edward Gorey, a minor Edward Gorey. But here, very interesting use of color. I really liked, I think these might have been watercolors. And, it's a lot of fun because it's just this pulpy horror movie stuff, but presented in a slightly different way. And I really enjoy it. But then when we go back to the Violenzia, the second Violenzia story had a little more interesting coherence, but it also really didn't. It was supposed to be kind of mysterious and dreamlike, but it just didn't click with me a whole lot. So I'm going to explore more Richard Sala, but at the moment I have him kind of pegged as an Edward Gorey wannabe. Who just went a little deeper into the comic side of things than others. Okay, so that's that. Let's just do a quick look at the interiors of Rise of the Oceans. Is basically a civilization underwater, gets horrible things done to it by the surface people, so attacks the surface. Familiar plot line. But just, familiar plot line from like Submariner. But I don't know, very cool visuals. It's really more of an art book than a book with a story, even though there is this bit of a story to it. Yeah. So these kind of books are expensive for the amount of time you actually spend reading them. It's more part of like your art collection. But I'd like to see more work by this creator. And the creator's name is it on the cover? It might just be this signature, which I can't really read. David somebody. I apologize, David, for not remembering your last name. That's funny not to put your name on the cover. Is it hidden somewhere? Oh well. And last, but not least, although maybe least in a way, the Pirates of Pendarve. So you've got this Ming the Merciless type character who realizes there's an anomaly in the universe that he can make use of, and that anomaly is this character, Storm, who is apparently a character out of time. Like maybe he comes originally from the 20th or 21st century, and time traveled a few million years into the future when Earth is a more barbaric place. And I guess he's had some previous adventures on Earth, and then he, Ming the Merciless's ray beam grabs him to bring him to Ming's world, and his girlfriend, Ember, follows him. So they both find themselves floating in space. And so this place that they've been transported to is like a pocket of worlds with air between them. And so you can fly ships between worlds and travel somehow between worlds. And there's space whales with these very ugly blowholes. The poor space whale does not survive long. Interesting looking characters. So eventually these two characters team up to find this guy's daughter and to find his girlfriend Ember. And meanwhile, Ming the Merciless, who's not called Ming the Merciless, but the Ming-like character, has captured his girlfriend and is trying to capture him because of the anomaly, the space-time anomaly that he presents will give him special power. But the delight here is seeing all these sort of fantasy cliches painted in a painted version, coming alive in a painted version. The characterizations don't have much going for them, but I suppose you can read into them from all the other books you've read. There's different sort of almost absurd cultures. The law on this pirate planet is very strict, but very arbitrary and cruel. And so you even get the classic thing where the hero becomes a slave and is sent to the mines and leads an uprising of the miners successfully. And then he and the miners at the end of the book are heading off on some pirate ships to have more adventures. And I think this character may become like he's not black, he's not an African American, but sort of your fellow slave who is from somewhere exotic, who's the most powerful one of the slaves, who becomes your best friend and helps you out. Anyway, so yeah, very cliched, but cool art. I think some of these books were reprinted in heavy metal at some point, but other than that, they're very hard. And I don't know if these particular adventures were. They're very hard to find in the United States and in English. I think there might have been 2 or 3 volumes published by Titan Books that came here to the U.S. at some point, back when $9.95 was a normal price, I guess. But I found a website where you can buy more English copies for quite a few euros, and I'm going to try a few volumes of that. So I just want to see more of this stuff. But again, Storm is this thing I'd heard about from Europe with this incredible art, and I thought the writing would be better. Part of the problem might be translation, because certainly the translators did a very sloppy job with the lettering. Often it kind of awkwardly, well, these examples aren't so bad, but doesn't fit that well into the panels. And I'm not finding good examples of that now. But at times I was distracted by the bad lettering. Maybe that was later in the book. So, and a lot of this dialogue and the caption boxes are clunky and feel like they could be streamlined a lot more. So I thought I didn't realize it would just be pure sort of mediocre pastiche in terms of the writing, but I'm still kind of excited by it. So that's everything here. I think I will turn around the camera and show you some original art. So I bought some more original art from Heritage Auctions, and I kind of forgot that I had won this one. I remembered bidding on it, but I bid some weeks I forget to, but some weeks I bid on dozens of artwork because and most weeks don't win anything, and so I only occasionally win things. And I'd forgotten I won this one, although I'm very glad I did. It is a Gene Colan page from Tomb of Dracula, from issue number 20. Here's what the cover of it looked like, a Gil Kane cover. As much as I love Gil Kane, I wasn't as big a fan of his Dracula covers as others. But anyway, that doesn't matter. I didn't buy the cover art. I don't think I own any cover art at all. It's always so expensive. What I got was on one page, pages I think 10 and 11. And here's page 10 on this side here. Page 10. And page 11. I don't know if they appeared side by side in the original comic. If I have the original comic in my storage area, I don't know for sure. I probably do. But so what it is, and you may have seen this in some other videos where I've shown original art, because I now have a couple of them, or maybe three of them. It is 2 pages of comics on one standard page of Marvel art paper. And it was an experiment in quotes, where they had artists do some 2-page things on a single page and paid them, I believe, only for a single page of art. And I think there was a bit of a rebellion from the artists and they stopped doing it, or I don't know what happened. In some cases, you'll see these issues with look like blown up panels filling 2 whole pages, and it's like, what happened to the art? And even here, I think you can see the art become less detailed. And the original art page is now about the size of the art page in the omnibus, which is a little bit bigger than the comic book. But so here's the whole page. That would be page 10 here and page 11 there. And I guess maybe I got it because there's Dracula is kind of only an obscured figure in part of this. I don't know why in several cases I've ended up getting these particular 2-for-1 pages because I didn't do it for very long, and it's just funny that so many have found their way into my original art collection. But it looks really nice, and there's a note here from Marv Wolfman saying, "Tom, ink face with white 2 to make it look blurry. Thanks, Marv." So they've used some kind of combination of white paint and what do you call it? The Ben-Day dots that you put on there. There's another name for that, where you cut it out and put it on. So, and then this was the published effect is much fainter than the original art effect there. You can see that. And in general, I don't know if reading along, you might have thought, well, his art looks a little sloppier. Let's see, side by side. His art looks a little sloppier. It doesn't look too sloppy, though, in the original inked pieces. And then I always loved this just visually love this Dr. Sun character, who was just a brain in a square jar. And this page, in the printed version does not look very detailed, but it looks fine on the original art. So anyway, I was very happy to get a page with Dr. Sun, and always happy whenever I can find a Gene Colan page that I can get. On the back it says 50% POS, 150% POS each page, JV. Not sure who JV would be. JV. And I guess this was originally sold for $10. I think it's probably years ago. $10. Way, it's what, 1,000 times more than that now. That's kind of mind blowing to think. But yeah, really happy to get that. I love collecting original art. So I'll catch you all later. I hope you've had a good week or so of reading comics, and keep enjoying your comics.